The Federal Reserve doesn't operate in a vacuum, and neither does the legal system that claims to hold our most powerful accountable. When you see a former president racing to federal court in response to testimony from a special counsel, what you're witnessing isn't just a legal maneuver. It's a collision between institutional power and individual political ambition that reveals the fractures in America's democratic framework. Jack Smith's testimony represents more than prosecutorial procedure. It's a moment where the narrative of American exceptionalism meets the reality of how power actually functions in this country. The urgency behind Trump's court filings tells us something critical about the relationship between legal institutions and political survival in an era where the traditional boundaries between them have become dangerously blurred. This isn't about personalities or political theater. It's about understanding how our judicial system responds when it's forced to confront someone who spent years reshaping the very norms it depends upon. The economic implications alone are staggering when you consider how political instability affects investor confidence, international relations, and the dollar's global standing. We're watching a stress test of American institutions in real time, and the outcome will determine whether accountability still means anything in a system increasingly dominated by wealth and concentrated power. Let me be clear about what's happening here, because the mainstream media will give you the surface-level drama, the courtroom theatrics, the back and forth between legal teams, but they won't give you the structural analysis of what this moment actually represents. When Donald Trump rushes to federal court in response to Jack Smith's testimony, we're not just watching one man's legal strategy unfold. We're watching the culmination of decades of erosion in the relationship between political power and legal accountability in the United States. This is a moment that didn't begin with Trump, and it won't end with him either. But it crystallizes something essential about how power operates in late-stage American capitalism. Think about what it means for a former president to be in this position. Not just any former president, but one who commanded the executive branch, who appointed federal judges, who wielded the pardon power, who had direct influence over the Department of Justice itself. The irony is almost too obvious to state, but it needs to be said anyway. The very institutions that Trump once controlled are now the ones scrutinizing his conduct. But here's where the analysis gets interesting, because if you think this is simply about justice catching up with wrongdoing, you're missing the deeper dynamic at play. This is about competing factions within the American ruling class using legal mechanisms to settle political scores and establish dominance. Jack Smith isn't some independent crusader for truth. He's an instrument of one segment of the establishment pushing back against another segment that Trump represents. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about how the federal court system functions in cases like this. The courts are not neutral arbiters floating above the political fray, dispensing wisdom and justice with perfect objectivity. They are institutions embedded in the same power structure that produces our political class, funded by the same economic system, staffed by people who come from the same elite educational institutions, the same law firms, the same networks of influence and money. When Trump rushes to federal court, he's not entering some sacred temple of impartial justice. He's entering another arena of political combat, one where the rules are different, but the stakes are just as high. The judges who will hear his arguments, the prosecutors who will oppose him, the entire apparatus of federal justice, all of it exists within a framework that ultimately serves to maintain the stability of the system itself, not to challenge its fundamental injustices. Jack Smith's testimony is significant not because it reveals some shocking new truth about Trump's behavior, but because it represents the formal mechanisms of the state moving against someone who, despite being part of the ruling class, violated certain unwritten rules about how power is supposed to be exercised. Trump's presidency was disruptive, not because he challenged capitalism or imperialism or the military-industrial complex. He embraced all of those things enthusiastically. He was disruptive because he was too obvious, too crass, too willing to say the quiet parts out loud. He didn't maintain the veneer of respectability that the American empire needs to function smoothly on the world stage. He embarrassed the establishment, and more importantly, he proved that the emperor has no clothes, that the system is far more fragile and far more dependent on norms and customs than anyone wanted to admit. The urgency of Trump's court filings tells us something about his vulnerability, but it also tells us something about the stakes involved. For Trump personally, this is about staying out of prison, about protecting his wealth, about preserving his political viability for another run at power. But for the broader system, this is about reasserting control, about demonstrating that there are still consequences for going too far, about drawing a line that says you can be authoritarian, you can be corrupt, you can serve the interests of the wealthy and powerful, but you have to do it within certain boundaries. You can't attempt to overturn an election quite so brazenly. You can't undermine confidence in the electoral system quite so thoroughly. You can't make the contradictions of American democracy quite so visible to the average person. And here's where the economic dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Every day that this legal drama continues, every headline about Trump's court battles, every revelation from Jack Smith's investigation, it sends ripples through the global economy. International investors watch American political stability the way doctors monitor vital signs. They need to know that the system is predictable, that contracts will be enforced, that property rights will be protected, that the rule of law means something. When a former president is fighting criminal charges, when the peaceful transfer of power is called into question, when the legitimacy of elections becomes a partisan football, it shakes confidence in American institutions. That confidence is the foundation of the dollar's status as the global reserve currency. It's the basis for foreign investment in U.S. Treasury bonds. It's the reason multinational corporations are willing to do business under American legal frameworks. Trump understands this dynamic better than most people give him credit for. His entire business career was built on leveraging debt, manipulating bankruptcy laws, using the legal system as a weapon and a shield. He knows that in federal court, delay is a strategy. Complexity is a strategy. Overwhelming the system with motions and appeals and procedural challenges is a strategy. He's applying the same tactics he used in business litigation to his criminal defense. And why wouldn't he? The American legal system rewards those who can afford the best lawyers, who can tie up proceedings for years, who can exploit every technicality and loophole. This is not a flaw in the system. This is how the system is designed to work. It protects the wealthy and powerful while crushing ordinary people who can't afford competent legal representation. Jack Smith's testimony, whatever specific details it contains, represents the prosecution's attempt to cut through that fog of delay and complexity. Special counsels exist precisely because normal prosecutorial channels are considered too compromised, too political, too susceptible to interference from the executive branch. The appointment of a special counsel is itself an admission that the regular mechanisms of justice can't be trusted to handle cases involving the politically powerful. But even special counsels operate within the same constraints, the same institutional limitations. They can gather evidence, bring charges, present testimony, but they can't fundamentally alter the power dynamics that allowed someone like Trump to rise to the presidency in the first place. Let's talk about what those power dynamics actually are, because this is where most analysis falls short. Trump is a symptom, not a cause. He emerged from a political and economic system that has been failing ordinary Americans for decades. The deindustrialization of the Midwest, the stagnation of working-class wages, the explosion of inequality, the corruption of both major political parties by corporate money, the endless wars that enrich defense contractors while sacrificing working-class lives, the bailouts for banks while homeowners lost everything in the financial crisis. All of this created the conditions for a figure like Trump to exploit widespread anger and resentment. He didn't create that anger. He channeled it, manipulated it, directed it towards scapegoats and culture war distractions, but he didn't create it. And now the same establishment that created those conditions is using the legal system to neutralize Trump, not because they've suddenly discovered a commitment to justice, but because he became more trouble than he was worth. He was supposed to deliver tax cuts for the rich, deregulation for corporations, conservative judges for the federal bench, and then exit gracefully when his time was up. Instead, he clung to power, incited an insurrection, and forced the establishment to choose between their commitment to electoral democracy and their tolerance for authoritarian tendencies. They chose democracy, barely, not out of principle but out of necessity. The system can survive a lot of corruption and injustice, but it can't survive the complete collapse of faith in elections. That's where Trump crossed the line. The federal court proceedings we're witnessing now are the mechanism through which the establishment is trying to restore that faith, to demonstrate that accountability still exists, at least for those who threaten the system's stability. But notice what's not being prosecuted: the war crimes of previous administrations, the financial fraud that caused the 2008 crisis, the systematic exploitation of workers by corporations, the environmental destruction driven by fossil fuel companies, the political corruption embedded in campaign finance laws. None of that gets the special counsel treatment. None of that results in former presidents rushing to federal court to defend themselves, because all of that is normal. All of that is how the system is supposed to function. Trump's crime wasn't being corrupt. It was being corrupt in a way that made the corruption too obvious. Jack Smith's testimony is a moment of revelation, not because it exposes Trump's wrongdoing, which has been public knowledge for years, but because it forces us to confront the selective nature of American justice. Why is this behavior being prosecuted when so much other egregious behavior by the powerful goes unpunished? The answer is that prosecution is a political tool, deployed when necessary to maintain system stability, but withheld when it would threaten powerful interests. Trump threatened system stability. Wall Street executives who crashed the economy did not, because bailing them out and letting them continue was considered necessary for economic stability. Do you see the pattern? Justice is subordinate to the preservation of the system itself. Now, Trump's legal team will argue procedure, jurisdiction, constitutional interpretation, executive privilege, all the technical legal arguments that make these cases drag on for years. And those arguments matter in the immediate tactical sense. But strategically, what matters is whether the American legal system can demonstrate that it's still capable of holding powerful people accountable without completely destabilizing the political order. That's a narrow tightrope to walk. Prosecute Trump too aggressively, and you risk creating a martyr, energizing his base, potentially sparking more political violence. Fail to prosecute him adequately, and you send the message that attempted coups have no consequences, that the powerful can do whatever they want with impunity. Either outcome is dangerous for the establishment. This is why the pace of these proceedings matters so much. The timing of Jack Smith's testimony, the urgency of Trump's court filings, the back and forth of legal motions, all of it is part of a larger chess game where both sides are trying to control the narrative and the timeline. Trump wants delay, wants to push everything past the next election cycle, wants to potentially regain power and make all of this go away through presidential authority. The prosecution wants swift accountability, wants to demonstrate that the system works, wants to prevent Trump from using political power to escape legal consequences. These competing interests are playing out in federal court, but the real arena is public opinion, political mobilization, and ultimately the ballot box. And here's what should concern anyone who cares about genuine democracy and justice. Both sides of this legal battle are operating within a framework that leaves the underlying problems untouched. Whether Trump goes to prison or walks free, whether he's convicted or acquitted, the economic inequality will remain. The corporate control of politics will remain. The militarism and imperialism will remain. The exploitation of workers will remain. The climate crisis will remain. The legal battle between Trump and Jack Smith is a distraction from all of that, a spectacle that consumes our attention while the fundamental injustices of the system continue unabated. That doesn't mean the legal battle is unimportant. It matters for the rule of law, for precedent, for democratic norms. But we can't let it become the only thing we pay attention to. We can't let one man's legal troubles blind us to the systemic failures that produced him, and that will continue long after he's gone.